For anyone listening, I want you to imagine finding out that the biggest lie in your life was sitting inside your childhood home the whole time, close enough to touch, but hidden where you would never think to look. And imagine learning that the person who protected you the most was also the person who kept one last secret from you until the day she was gone. You were never supposed to read that letter, Nora, because your father wrote it for a daughter he knew I would never let him keep. My mother said those words to me in a shaking voice in her bedroom, standing in front of the old vanity mirror. She never let anyone move, less than an hour before her heart failed, and she never woke up again. 3 weeks later, my Uncle Julian went pale in the lawyer's office when I unfolded the letter she had hidden behind that mirror for 34 years and realized my father had known exactly what they were planning. As always, before we dive into a story with an ending that's going to feel really satisfying for you, let's do a quick roll call. Type present and the city you're watching from in the comments. For everyone who has liked and subscribed, I pray that God makes your problems easier, widens your provision, and keeps your body healthy. Thank you, my friends. Now listen carefully to my story. My name is Nora Bennett, and for most of my life, I believed two things without ever questioning them too deeply. The first was that my father had abandoned me before I was old enough to remember his face. The second was that my mother, Helen, had done everything she could to protect me from the damage he left behind. That version of my life made sense for a long time. It explained why there were no photographs of him in our house except one tiny picture tucked inside my mother's old Bible. It explained why my mother's expression changed every time I asked about him, like a door had closed behind her eyes. And it explained why the people on her side of the family, especially her younger brother Julian and their older sister Margaret, acted like my father's name was some contaminated thing that should never be spoken out loud. I grew up in a quiet town outside Columbus, in a narrow 2-story house with cream siding, a square front porch, and rose bushes my mother somehow kept alive through every season. She was a school librarian, the kind of woman who could calm a whole room just by lowering her voice. She was neat, disciplined, and careful with everything, from her money to her words. She ironed pillowcases. She paid bills the day they arrived. She kept greeting cards tied in bundles with ribbon. If there was chaos inside her, and I'm sure there was, she spent my whole childhood making sure I only ever saw a calm surface. Because of that, I never thought of us as tragic. We didn't have much, but we had routines. Pancakes on Sundays. Grocery shopping after church. Old movies on rainy afternoons. My mother humming while folding laundry. I had the life of a girl raised by one steady hand, and for a very long time, I was grateful enough not to ask too many questions. Still, the missing father shaped everything whether we admitted it or not. When I was 7, another girl in my class asked me why my dad never came to school events. I told her he lived far away and worked a lot. When I was 12, I found out that wasn't true because I asked my mother directly if he was dead, and she looked at me in total shock and said, "No, don't ever say that." But she still didn't tell me where he was. When I was 16, I found a stack of documents in a kitchen drawer while looking for stamps. One was my birth certificate. My father's name was there in clean black print, Daniel Rowan. I remember staring at it like it was a stranger standing in my kitchen. Daniel Rowan. Not a ghost. Not a blank space. A real man with a real name. I took the paper into the living room and asked my mother why she had never told me. She put down her tea, looked at the certificate in my hand, and said, very quietly, "Because names can become invitations, and some people should stay in the past." At 16, that sounded wise. At 34, I understand it was also a warning. I became a family attorney, which people always find ironic once they hear my story. Maybe they assume I chose law because I grew up in conflict. The truth is almost the opposite. I chose it because I grew up in silence. I got very good at noticing what people were not saying, and I built a career around documents, motives, signatures, timing, and the quiet spaces between one statement and another. By the time my mother got sick, I was living in Chicago, engaged once, and then not engaged, successful enough to pay my own mortgage, and disciplined enough to keep my private life from turning messy. I wasn't lonely, exactly, but I had built myself into someone very self-contained. People at work called me composed. Friends said I was hard to read. Men I dated usually said some version of, "I never know what you need." The honest answer was that I had learned very young not to need too much from anyone. Then, in late October, my mother called me on a Wednesday night and said, "Nora, I need you to come home this weekend. Don't wait too long." I was standing in my kitchen, still in office clothes, one heel off and one heel on. I could hear her breathing, and it sounded wrong. Thin. Tired. She had been dealing with heart problems for over a year, but she had a habit of minimizing everything. If she said don't wait too long, then I knew better than to delay. "I can come tomorrow," I said immediately. There was a short silence, and then she said, "Good." That was it. No dramatic speech. No explanation. Just that one word. When I drove into my hometown the next afternoon, the trees were stripped and brown at the edges, the sky heavy and flat. The house looked smaller than I remembered. My mother was standing in the front window when I parked, one hand against the curtain, as if she'd been there for a while. The first thing I noticed when I got inside was that my Uncle Julian was already there. He was leaning in the doorway to the dining room, holding a mug of coffee, dressed in one of his expensive sweaters that always looked too soft for him. Julian had built a financial planning business out of charm, patience, and the ability to sound sincere while saying almost nothing. He was my mother's younger brother by 6 years, and growing up, he was the relative who brought me birthday gifts I didn't ask for and asked questions that felt weirdly specific. Not warm questions. Inventory questions. "How's the condo?" he'd say. "Still at that downtown firm? You ever think about selling and moving somewhere less expensive?" Even as a child, I understood that he didn't talk to gather closeness. He talked to collect data. He smiled when he saw me. "Nora, you made good time." I left early. He nodded toward the hall. "Your mother's been resting. She'll be glad you're here." Something about his tone rubbed me the wrong way. It sounded less like concern and more like management, like he was overseeing a process and I had arrived on schedule. My Aunt Margaret appeared from the kitchen a second later, wiping her hands on a dish towel, even though I'd never once seen her wash a dish voluntarily. She was elegant in that polished, brittle way some women carry like armor. Her blonde hair was pinned back, lipstick perfect, pearl studs in her ears even at home. She air-kissed my cheek and said, "You look thin, dear. Chicago must be exhausting." "Nice to see you too." She smiled as if I had complimented her. That first evening, the house had an odd energy I couldn't fully place. My mother was pale but alert, sitting up in bed with a wool blanket over her legs. She squeezed my hand for a long time when I walked in, and I felt how cold her fingers were. "You should have told me it was this bad," I said. "It's not as dramatic as your face says," she answered, which was exactly like her. I sat beside her and helped adjust her pillows. "Did the doctor change your medication again?" "A little." "Why are Julian and Margaret here?" Her eyes shifted toward the bedroom door, then back to me. "Because family appears when they think time has become valuable." That line sat in my chest all evening. At dinner it got worse. We ate roasted chicken, green beans, and potatoes at the same oak table I had done homework on for years. My mother barely touched her food. Julian cut his meat into neat pieces. Margaret kept refilling my mother's water before the glass was half empty, acting so attentive it almost looked loving, except there was no softness in her face. Julian cleared his throat and said, "Helen, I spoke to the notary this afternoon. He said if there are any updates you want to make, it would be better to do them while everything is clear and calm." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. My mother didn't look up. "There's nothing to update." Margaret gave a small laugh. "Well, that's not entirely true, is it? Life changes. Circumstances change. Nora has her own career and her own property. It's not as if she needs every burden dropped into her lap." I put my fork down very carefully. "If you're talking about my mother's estate while she's sitting right here, you can at least try not to sound like vultures." Margaret's expression barely changed. "Oh, don't be dramatic. We're discussing practicalities." Julian leaned back in his chair and gave me that measured, patient look he used when he wanted to imply I was overreacting. "No one is trying to upset anyone. Your mother's health is delicate. We're trying to help. My mother's hand tightened around her water glass. I said there's nothing to update. There was enough force in her voice that the room went quiet. But only for a second. Then Julian said, very mildly, of course. We just don't want confusion later. Confusion later. It was such a clean phrase. So polite. But I felt something sharp under it. After dinner, while Margaret fussed with the dishes and Julian took a phone call on the back porch, I helped my mother back to her room. When I tucked the blanket over her knees, she caught my wrist. Nora. I looked up. What? If I ask you something tonight, you have to listen carefully. No anger first. No questions first. Just listen. A strange chill moved down my back. Okay. But then she closed her eyes like the effort of speaking had exhausted her, and she whispered, later. I barely slept. I took the old guest room at the end of the hall, the one with faded blue wallpaper and a dresser that still held school trophies and a lamp with a cracked ceramic base. Around 2 a.m, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Not my mother's. Too heavy. A floorboard creaked near her room, then another. I opened my door a few inches and saw Julian standing near her bedroom door, his back to me. He wasn't knocking. He was listening. For 1 second, I almost called out to him. But something stopped me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the way his shoulders were set, tense but controlled, like a man waiting for the right moment to enter a negotiation. He must have heard my door shift because he turned. His face changed very fast when he saw me. First alert, then relaxed. Couldn't sleep, he asked. Apparently, neither could you. He smiled. I was checking on Helen. At 2 a.m? Without knocking? She's my sister. And she's asleep. He held my gaze for a second too long. Try not to assume the worst of people, Nora. It makes life harder than it needs to be. That was the kind of sentence he always used. Calm on the outside. A correction hidden inside. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my aunt on the phone in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop at first. I was halfway down the stairs before I realized her voice was low and urgent. No, not that version, she was saying. The signed one. The newer file. Because if she changes her mind now, then we need the cleanest copy ready. I froze on the landing. A pause. Then Margaret said, I know she trusts the girl. That's the problem. The girl. That was me. I stepped into the kitchen loudly enough that she turned, startled for the first time in my life. Her expression corrected itself within a second. Oh. You're up. I am, I said. Who are you talking to? An assistant. At what? At life, Nora. She gave a cool smile and picked up the kettle. Coffee. I stared at her, but she had already gone back to being polished and vague. My mother was stronger that afternoon. Stronger physically, at least. Something in her had settled. She asked Margaret to go pick up a prescription that, as far as I knew, had already been filled. Then she asked Julian to stop by the pharmacy across town for a special tea she suddenly claimed she needed. I watched both of them leave through the front window, and the second Julian's car turned the corner, my mother said, "Lock the front door." I looked at her. Mom, please. I locked it. Then she took me into her bedroom and closed the door herself. That room had barely changed in 20 years. Her bed was still covered with the same quilted spread. The vanity sat against the far wall under the window, its oval mirror edged in dark wood. That mirror had always been off-limits. I had dusted around it, vacuumed under it, and once, at age 11, gotten scolded for touching the frame while I was helping clean. My mother walked to it slowly, one hand against the dresser for support. "What are you doing?" I asked. She touched the edge of the mirror and said, "I should have told you years ago. I kept thinking I had more time." Then she slid her fingers behind the frame, reached into the narrow gap between mirror and wall, and pulled out a flat, sealed envelope yellowed with age. I didn't move. It felt like the room had suddenly become too quiet to breathe in. On the front of the envelope, in dark blue ink that had faded but not blurred, were the words, "For my daughter, on the day she is old enough to know who I was." I heard myself say, "What is that?" My mother turned and held it so tightly I thought she might crush it. Her face looked older than it had that morning, but also strangely lighter, as if carrying the weight had been harder than preparing to set it down. "It's from your father." I stared at her. The only sound in the room was the ticking wall clock above the doorway. "My father wrote me a letter?" "Yes." "When?" "The year you were born." I felt heat rise into my face so quickly, it was almost dizzying. "You had this all my life?" She closed her eyes for 1 second. "Yes." I took a step back. "You hid it? For 34 years. "Yes." I wish I could say I responded like the calm, intelligent adult I usually was. I didn't. My hands started shaking so badly, I had to grip the back of her vanity chair. "Why?" I said. "Why would you do that to me?" Her eyes filled immediately, but she didn't look away. "Because I was afraid. Of him. Of what would happen if anyone knew what he wrote." "Anyone?" "Mom, he wrote it to me." "I know." I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. It came out sharp and broken. "All these years you let me believe he walked away. You let me hate a man I never even met." Her voice went rough. "I let you survive." That stopped me for a second. She held out the envelope, then pulled it back before I could take it.
"Listen first," she said. "Please."
For once, let me say it the right way. I didn't want to. I wanted to tear the letter open and read it right there. But something in her face made me stay still. "When I met your father, Daniel was not the man my family said he was," she began. "He was thoughtful, careful, and far more intelligent than anyone gave him credit for. He worked in property development then, but not in the flashy way Julian admired. He handled land records, zoning files, title searches. He saw things other people missed. He remembered details. He kept copies." That sentence hit me because it sounded like someone else I knew.
"Me,"
my mother continued, speaking slowly, as if she had rehearsed this in her mind many times. "We were engaged before I told my family. Julian was already working with certain investors by then. Not on paper, not openly, but he was close to men who liked easy profit and quiet signatures. Daniel noticed irregularities in some property transfers tied to our family land. Nothing that would mean much to the world, maybe, but enough to expose fraud inside the family." My throat tightened. "What family land?" "The acreage your grandfather left in trust," she said. "The old Rowan Creek parcel outside town. It wasn't worthless the way your aunt always claimed. It became extremely valuable when the highway expansion was approved. Daniel realized some preliminary documents had been altered months before the public announcement." "By who?" She didn't answer right away, which was an answer by itself. I said it for her. "Julian." "And Margaret knew enough to stay quiet," she said. I felt the floor tilt under me. My whole childhood, Julian had acted like the stable one, the sensible one, the financially literate one. Margaret had acted like the dignified older sister who simply liked order. And now my mother was telling me they had been mixed up in fraud before I was even born. "He confronted them?" I asked. "Not directly. Not at first. He told me he wanted to go to a lawyer and make sure every copy of every record was protected before he did anything. He believed that if the truth was organized properly, no one could bury it." That sounded intelligent, strategic, not dramatic, not reckless, which made the next question worse. "So what happened to him?" My mother looked at the envelope. "He knew I was pregnant before anyone else did. He was so happy he could barely speak. 2 days later, he told me he had written something for you in case anything happened and said I needed to trust only what was documented, not what people cried about later." My skin went cold. "In case anything happened?" I repeated. Her mouth trembled. "He was supposed to meet a surveyor outside Newark. His car went off a rural road in heavy rain. That was the official story." Official story. As a lawyer, I know exactly how dangerous those 2 words can be. I whispered, "Do you think it wasn't an accident?" She looked at me with a kind of exhausted pain that answered before she spoke. "I think Daniel believed he was in danger. I think he wrote that letter because he knew too much. And I think after he was gone, I was too frightened to trust anyone around me. I could barely process what I was hearing. My father had not been some careless man who disappeared. He had been afraid. He had written to me. And my mother had hidden the letter all my life because she believed the people around us were capable of more than cruelty. Why not go to the police? I asked. I was 23, pregnant, grieving, and surrounded by my own family telling me I was hysterical, she said. Julian told me stress was making me paranoid. Margaret said Daniel had always wanted to feel important and had probably exaggerated everything. My mother told me I needed to think of the baby and stay quiet. Every time I tried to say something was wrong, they made me sound unstable. Gaslighting. Clean, early, effective. My chest hurt. So, you kept his letter hidden behind a mirror for 34 years? Yes. Why there? Because no one was allowed to touch it. And because every day I looked at myself, I had to remember what fear had cost. That line broke something in me. I sat on the edge of the bed because my knees no longer felt reliable. Mom, what exactly is in the letter? I only read it once, she said. The day after he died. You read my letter? Yes. Her honesty made it worse and better at the same time. What does it say? She swallowed. That he loved you before you were born. That if anything happened to him, you should one day be told the truth. And that there were records hidden where no one in my family would think to search. I looked up fast. What records? I don't know. He didn't tell me where in plain language. He wrote in references. He always did that when he thought someone else might intercept something. I stood again. Then, why didn't you tell me sooner? When I was 25, 30, anything? I could have handled it. She stared at me for a long moment. Because by then Julian had built a reputation, a business, a circle of respectable people who trusted him. Margaret had married into money and polished the family image until even I sometimes questioned myself. And you, her eyes softened. You were finally building a life untouched by them. I wanted one thing in this world, to stay clean. That sounded like love. It also sounded like damage. I said, you should have let me choose. Yes, she whispered. I know. There was no point pretending there wasn't anger between us. It was there, raw and immediate. But under it, something heavier had arrived. A sense that the story of my life had just split down the middle, revealing another one running underneath. My mother took the envelope in both hands. There's more. I almost laughed from the sheer pressure of it. Of course there is. I changed my will 6 months ago. That pulled me back into the room immediately. What? I left the house to you. Everything else is simple. Accounts, savings, personal effects. But the house is yours. My first reaction wasn't gratitude. It was fear. Does Julian know?
No.
Does Margaret?
No.
Then why were they talking to a notary yesterday? Her gaze shifted to the bedroom door again. Because they believe I was going to reverse it. Why would they believe that? Because they've been working on me for months. She took a slow breath. Julian said the house was too much responsibility for one woman with a demanding career. Margaret said it should stay within the family line, as though you are somehow not that. Then Julian suggested creating a trust he would oversee to protect the property. I stared at her. A trust he would oversee. Yes. Mom, that's not protection. That's control. I know. My jaw tightened. Did you sign anything?
No.
I believed her. But I also knew manipulative people rarely stop after one failed attempt. That evening, Julian and Margaret returned almost at the same time. My mother had put the letter away by then, though not back behind the mirror. She slipped it into the zippered lining of an old garment bag in her closet and told me quietly, not a word. Not yet. So I said nothing. At dinner, Julian was extra careful. Too careful. He asked my mother about her medication schedule. He asked me whether I planned to stay a week. He mentioned, in a casual tone, that a notary could stop by the house whenever necessary if paperwork became tiring. Margaret talked about preserving family harmony. She used that phrase twice. I watched them with different eyes now. And once you see people differently, it is almost impossible to unsee them. Julian's concern was too timed. Margaret's sympathy was too polished. Even the way they exchanged tiny glances across the table had changed meaning. Before, it had read like siblings coordinating care. Now it looked like alignment, strategy, silent checking. My mother barely ate. After dinner, she asked me to bring her tea upstairs. When I entered her room with the tray, she was sitting on the bed in her nightgown, both hands pressed against the mattress. "Nora," she said, and her voice was suddenly weaker than it had been all day. I set the tray down at once. "What's wrong?" Chest pressure. My whole body went cold. "I'm calling an ambulance." She caught my hand. "Wait."
No.
"Wait," she repeated, stronger now, forcing the word through the pain. "The letter." I stared at her. "If anything happens tonight, don't let Julian near my closet." For 1 second, anger flashed through my fear. "Mom, stop talking like that." She held my wrist so tightly it hurt. "Promise me." "I promise." "Read it only when you are alone." "Okay. And if there's a file key." "A what?" Her breath caught. She closed her eyes hard, as if pain had cut the sentence in half. "If there's a file key, don't keep it in this house." I called 911. Everything after that became fast and bright and ugly in the way emergencies always do. Paramedics came. The front door banged open. Margaret cried too quickly, as if she had practiced the sound. Julian kept trying to stand close enough to hear everything the medic said. I moved between him and my mother twice without even thinking. At the hospital, under the fluorescent lights of the cardiac unit, I signed forms, answered questions, gave dates of birth, confirmed insurance, called my assistant in Chicago to cancel 3 days of meetings, and sat in a molded plastic chair while machines spoke in steady electronic beeps from behind a curtain. Julian sat beside me for a while, elbows on knees, hands clasped. "You're wound very tight," he said quietly. I didn't even look at him. "My mother might be dying."
She's fragile, yes.
"But these events can seem bigger in the moment than they are." That sentence made me turn. He gave me a solemn expression. "I'm only saying this because I care about both of you. Helen has been under stress. She's been revisiting old stories, old fears. Sometimes near the end of life, people lose perspective and attach meaning to things that aren't really there." I stared at him for a full 3 seconds. Then I said, "That is a very interesting thing to say to a lawyer." His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "You think I'm trying to manipulate you?" he asked softly. "I think you choose your timing very carefully." He let out a small breath through his nose. "Nora, grief can make intelligent people invent enemies. You need to be careful." There it was. Not a threat, exactly. Something cleaner than that. A warning shaped like advice. I leaned back in my chair. "And you need to stop speaking to me like I'm 12. A nurse came over a minute later and told us my mother wanted to see only me. When I walked into the room, she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. There were wires across her chest, an oxygen line under her nose, and a grayness around her mouth that scared me more than anything else had that night. I took her hand carefully. "I'm here." She turned her head toward me and smiled, but it was faint. "Good. You're going to be okay," I said, because people say that even when they are not sure. She watched me for a second with that maddening mother look that says, "I know you're lying for my sake, but I love you for trying." "Nora," she whispered. "I'm sorry." I leaned closer immediately. "Don't. Not now."
For the years, she said.
My eyes burned. "We can talk about that later." She shook her head once, barely. "Read him exactly." He chose words carefully. "My father." She meant my father. I nodded because it was the only thing I could do. Then she said one more sentence, so quietly, I nearly missed it. "Don't let them turn your intelligence against you." That sentence stayed with me, because that was exactly what they had done to her. They had taken her caution, her decency, her desire not to sound irrational, and they had used all of it to box her in. They had made her second-guess her own instincts until fear became a room she lived inside. I sat with her until after midnight. At some point a doctor came in, then another. There was talk of observation, of instability, of monitoring through the night. Julian and Margaret were sent home by hospital staff because only immediate next of kin could remain in the unit. Julian did not like that. He argued politely for almost 5 minutes. I watched him do it and thought, you are too invested in proximity. My mother passed just before dawn. The doctor told me her heart had failed after a cascade of complications they could not reverse. He used calm words, compassionate words. I heard almost none of them properly. There was a rushing in my ears, then an unnatural stillness, as if sound itself had become distant. I stood beside her bed after everyone else had stepped out and looked at her face. It was peaceful in a way that made me angry. Peaceful after years of fear. Peaceful after carrying the wrong burden for too long. Peaceful when I had just found out my life had been built on a secret. I cried then. Not neatly. Not silently. I cried with my forehead against the side rail of her bed and one hand wrapped around hers until a nurse gently touched my shoulder and asked if I wanted more time. By the afternoon, I was back at the house in black slacks and yesterday's sweater, standing in my mother's bedroom with the curtains half closed. The house felt altered already, not because anything had changed physically, but because the one person who gave it a center was gone. I locked the bedroom door. Then I went straight to the closet, found the garment bag, unzipped the lining, and took out the envelope. My hands were steady this time. Too steady. I sat in the vanity chair she had used for years and looked at the front again. For my daughter, on the day she is old enough to know who I was. I opened it carefully, so I wouldn't tear the paper inside. The letter was written on cream stationery in dark ink, dense but orderly. No wasted space. The date at the top made my chest tighten. It was 6 weeks before I was born. My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either your mother has finally decided that silence protects no one, or I am no longer alive to stand in front of you and tell you this myself. I pray it is the first, but I am not foolish enough to assume I control what comes next. I had to stop there because I couldn't see for a second. He was real. Not as a story. Not as a name. Real enough to have sat somewhere with a pen in his hand and imagined me one day opening that page. I kept reading. You should know first that I wanted you. Before I knew whether you were a son or a daughter, before I knew whether you would inherit my eyes or your mother's patience, I wanted you with my whole heart. If anyone ever tells you that I left because I did not care, they are lying to protect themselves. My breathing went shallow. I read every line twice. Your mother is braver than she knows, but she has been raised among people who understand pressure better than they understand love. If she seems afraid, believe that there is a reason. If she seems silent, do not mistake it for agreement. There are people around her who wear decency like a church coat. They put it on when witnesses are present and hang it up when the door closes. That line felt like being struck. He knew them. He knew exactly what they were. Farther down, the letter shifted. The language became more coded, but not impossible to follow. There are records relating to land titles, amended valuations, and draft conveyances that do not match the filings your uncle intends others to rely upon. If the cedar keepsake box remains where your mother once said no guest would ever think to look, then what matters most may still be preserved. If not, trust dates over signatures and copies over charm. My uncle. Not named, but obvious. My pulse was pounding by then. There was one more paragraph that changed everything again. And one last thing. If events unfold as I suspect, then there may be an attempt to make your mother appear unstable, grieving beyond reason, or confused about her own intentions. If such a campaign begins, it means they are not finished with what they started. Protect her. Protect the house. And never let any revised document near a sickbed without independent witnesses. I lowered the page and stared straight ahead into the mirror. For a strange second, I could see both of us there. Me sitting in the chair. My mother in memory, behind me. 34 years of silence between us. And behind that, a man I had never met speaking through paper more clearly than some people speak face to face. The cedar keepsake box. I had no idea what that meant yet. But I knew one thing with perfect certainty. My mother had not died at the end of a simple family story. She had died in the middle of one. And as I folded the letter back into the envelope, I heard the front door open downstairs and Julian's voice call my name in that careful, polished tone of his. I didn't answer, because for the first time in my life, I understood that whatever was coming next had probably started long before I was born. I stayed in my mother's bedroom until I heard Julian call my name a second time. Nora? His tone carried up the stairs, smooth and patient, like he was checking on someone delicate. I slipped the letter back into its envelope, then into the inside pocket of my blazer. I stood, looked at myself in the mirror once, and saw a face I almost recognized and almost didn't. My eyes were red, but the rest of me had gone calm in a way that usually meant I was most dangerous. When I opened the bedroom door, Julian was standing at the bottom of the stairs with one hand on the banister. Margaret was behind him in the foyer, still in yesterday's dark dress and pearls, as if she had gone home, slept, and reassembled herself for public grief. "There you are," Julian said softly. "We were worried." "Worried?" I came down one step at a time. "About what?" "That you were alone up there after." He let the sentence trail off and lowered his eyes for effect. "This is a terrible shock." Margaret pressed a hand to her chest. "We should be discussing arrangements, darling. Your mother would want things handled with dignity." I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped in front of them. "She's been dead less than 12 hours, I said. "And the two of you are already managing the atmosphere." Julian took that in with a small nod, as though I had said something understandable but unfortunate. "Grief comes out in many forms." "No," I said. "Control comes out in many forms. Grief is something else." Margaret's expression thinned. "You are exhausted." "I am," I said. "Which means this is not the day to mistake my exhaustion for weakness." Neither of them answered that. The rest of that day moved in pieces. Calls had to be made. The funeral home. Church. Death certificate details. A casserole appeared from the woman next door. Someone from my mother's library staff dropped off flowers with a note so heartfelt I had to put it face down for a while, because reading it felt like being skinned alive. Through all of it, Julian stayed close. Too close. He made suggestions about everything: burial package, viewing schedule, obituary wording, even whether my mother's house should be secured properly if I intended to return to Chicago soon. That one stayed with me. Secured properly. As if my presence there was temporary. As if he was already preparing language for people to hear. By evening, I knew I couldn't stay in that house alone with them for even one more night without changing the balance somehow. I needed an ally. A real one. Not someone impressed by Julian's practiced sincerity or intimidated by Margaret's polished cruelty. Someone who knew me before any of this became complicated. So I called the one person I knew would come without asking stupid questions. Her name was Tessa Monroe, and she had been my closest friend since law school. Tessa had red hair, quick eyes, and a mind that moved like a blade underwater. She worked in regulatory litigation in Chicago and had the rare gift of sounding warm while noticing absolutely everything. She answered on the second ring.
"Hey.
Are you okay?" "No," I said. That was all it took. 3 hours later, she was standing on my mother's front porch in jeans, boots, and a camel coat, carrying an overnight bag and 2 coffees. When I opened the door, she looked at my face, set the coffees down on the hallway table, and hugged me so hard I almost lost the ability to stand upright. "I'm sorry," she said into my hair. "I know." When she pulled back, Julian appeared from the living room doorway with that same controlled expression. "And you are?" "Tessa Monroe," she said, extending a hand without hesitation. "Nora's friend." Julian shook it. "Julian Archer. Helen's brother." "I assumed as much," Tessa said pleasantly. For anyone else, that line would have sounded friendly. Because it was Tessa, I heard the edge in it immediately. That night, after Margaret and Julian finally left, I told Tessa everything from the moment my mother asked me to lock the door to the letter in my pocket. She didn't interrupt. She sat cross-legged on the guest room bed, one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold long ago, and listened with the kind of silence that actually supports you instead of pressuring you to perform. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said. "Okay."
"Yes. Which is not me minimizing this.
It's me organizing it. First, your father's letter is evidence. Second, if he referenced a cedar keepsake box, we find it before your uncle gets creative. Third, nobody signs anything. Fourth, you do not tell Julian or Margaret what you know. I looked at her and felt the first tiny drop of relief I'd felt all day. You make it sound simple. It isn't simple, she said. It's just structured. That was the difference between panic and strategy. Structure. We searched the house the next morning.
Not randomly. Carefully.
That's the thing people like Julian count on when they underestimate women like my mother and me. They assume emotion makes us messy. But grief didn't make me sloppy. It made me precise. The letter had said, if the cedar keepsake box remains where your mother once said no guest would ever think to look, then what matters most may still be preserved. I said the line out loud twice while standing in the kitchen. Tessa leaned against the counter. Did your mother have a phrase she used often? Some place she treated like an obvious blind spot. I closed my eyes and let the house rise in memory. The linen closet, the attic rafters, under the basement stairs. Then suddenly, as if my mind had been waiting for me to stop trying too hard, I heard my mother's voice from years earlier. No guest would ever think to look in a place like that. I opened my eyes. The sewing room. Tessa straightened immediately. You have a sewing room? My mother did. No one used it but her. Margaret hated it because she said it smelled like old fabric and lavender. Julian never set foot in it unless he had to carry something. We went up together. The sewing room was a narrow back room on the second floor with one window facing the yard, shelves of folded fabric, and an old Singer cabinet my mother had inherited from her own mother. It wasn't a glamorous room. It was practical. Thread spools, dress forms, jars of buttons, pattern envelopes stacked in old magazine holders. It was exactly the kind of room arrogant people dismiss because it looks domestic and ordinary. We searched in silence for 15 minutes. Then Tessa said, Nora. I turned. She was crouched beside the lowest shelf of the old cabinet, one hand behind a row of storage boxes. She pulled out a cedar box about 14 inches long, simple, darkened with age, no label on it. For 1 second, neither of us moved. Then I crossed the room, knelt beside her, and took it in both hands. The lid was not locked. It lifted with one clean motion. Inside were 3 manila folders, one small brass key taped beneath the lid, and a sealed cassette tape in a plastic case with Daniel's handwriting on a strip of white label. If paper fails, let my voice stand. I think my entire nervous system stopped and restarted in that exact moment. Tessa stared at the contents. Your father was not playing around. No, I whispered. He wasn't. The first folder contained copies of land title records and survey maps tied to the Rowan Creek parcel. The second contained a chain of letters between Daniel and a lawyer named Howard Pike dated the year before I was born. The third held photocopies of valuation drafts, county filing notes, and one memo with handwritten initials I recognized instantly from papers my mother had signed over the years.
J.A.
Julian Archer. I sat back on my heels. Tessa picked up the brass key. This is your file key, I'm guessing. I nodded slowly, but my mind was already racing through the possible uses. Safe deposit box, bank lockbox, filing cabinet, off-site storage. We took everything downstairs and locked ourselves in the dining room like we were preparing trial exhibits, because in a way, we were. The letters between my father and Howard Pike filled in pieces my mother had never known or had never dared to say out loud. Daniel had discovered that a parcel of family trust land was being undervalued privately, while preliminary state infrastructure plans suggested it would soon triple in worth. Someone inside the family had been pushing draft transfers and shell arrangements to position certain buyers before public notice made the land expensive. Daniel believed the arrangement was fraudulent and that Julian had access to both internal family trust information and outside investor interest. And then there was one paragraph in a letter dated just 11 days before Daniel's car accident. If anything happens to me, look first at who benefits from speed. Honest transactions can survive daylight. Fraud needs time pressure, confusion, and one grieving witness made to doubt herself. I put the paper down and stared at the table. Tessa said nothing for a second. Then, this man wrote like he was building a case. He probably was. There was another problem. Howard Pike, the lawyer. The letters were old. He might be dead, retired, unreachable, or useless. But unlike in dramatic stories where people magically find one perfect witness still sitting in the same office waiting to save the day, real life usually gives you fragments and resistance. So we worked like adults. We verified. I searched state bar records. Retired. Tessa searched obituary databases. Not dead. Then she found a current address outside Dayton attached to a legal consulting firm. I called. A receptionist answered. Yes, Mr. Pike still took select appointments. No, he did not discuss former clients over the phone. Yes, he could see me the following afternoon if I was able to come in person. I booked it immediately. The funeral was the next day. That alone felt cruel. To have to stand in a church burying my mother while also carrying the live wire of what she had finally told me. But grief does not pause because truth arrives. If anything, truth makes grief heavier because now you understand how much someone endured while loving you. My mother's service was simple and beautiful. Library staff came. Former neighbors came. A retired music teacher from my middle school came and cried through the first hymn. I gave the eulogy because there was no one else I trusted to say the right things. I stood at the lectern and looked at the room full of people who had known my mother in pieces. The kind librarian. The patient church volunteer. The widow who always brought soup to sick neighbors. The woman who never asked for much. I told them who she was to me. I said she was the first person who taught me that dignity is not the same as silence, even if she struggled to separate the two in her own life. I said she loved through routines, through loyalty, through consistency, through remembering what people needed before they said it aloud. I said she had a steady soul in a world that often rewards louder people. And then I looked at the front pew where Julian and Margaret were sitting with suitable expressions, and I added, and I think some people spend years misunderstanding quiet women because they assume stillness means surrender. My mother was never surrendered. Julian's jaw changed. Only slightly. But I saw it.
So did Tessa.
After the service, while people gathered in clusters outside the church hall, Margaret approached me with tears that appeared too fast to trust. Helen would be proud of you, she said, squeezing my forearm. I looked at her hand until she removed it. That depends, I said, on whether people finally stop speaking for her. For once, Margaret had no smooth answer ready. The appointment with Howard Pike was the next afternoon. He was 80 if he was a day, with white hair, clear eyes, and the posture of a man who had spent a lifetime watching people lie from comfortable chairs. His office smelled faintly of paper, lemon polish, and old radiators. When I placed Daniel's letters on his desk, he did not dramatize his reaction. He simply put on his reading glasses, read the first page, then looked up at me for a long moment.
You're his daughter, he said.
Yes. I wondered if this day would come. My whole chest tightened. You knew my father well? Well enough to know he was too careful to invent fear. He folded his hands. And well enough to know your mother was under pressure she should never have faced alone. I sat straighter. Did he tell you he thought he was in danger? He told me he believed he had uncovered a pattern of document manipulation tied to trust land and early value access. He also told me that if anything happened to him, your mother might be convinced she was imagining the seriousness of it. Which is exactly what happened. Howard Pike nodded once. That does not surprise me. He then did something I will never forget. He unlocked a metal cabinet behind his desk, removed a faded file, and set it in front of me. I kept this because your father asked me to. Inside were contemporaneous notes, copies of county correspondence, and a memorandum signed by Howard Pike himself verifying that Daniel had delivered documentary concerns related to the Rowan Creek parcel and instructed that records be preserved if his position became unexpectedly interrupted. Unexpectedly interrupted. Such a lawyer phrase. So restrained. So devastating. But the most important item was a copy of a safety deposit inventory receipt from a local bank, dated the month before I was born, with Daniel Rowan listed as renter and a secondary release instruction tied to a brass key number. I reached into my bag and placed the small brass key from the cedar box on the desk. Howard Pike looked at it and said, "That will do." My fingers curled inward. "What's in the box?" "I never knew," he said. He told me only that if the records in his home copies were destroyed or hidden, the rest would survive elsewhere. Tessa, who had come with me, asked, "If we access it now, what's the cleanest legal path?" Howard Pike looked almost pleased by the question. "You bring proof of death, identity, and the secondary release instruction. Then you pray the bank's archival chain is better than most institutions." That afternoon, we went to the bank. It was a modest branch in Newark, older building, newer security. I stood at a polished desk under flat winter light and presented identification, my father's letter, the key, the inventory receipt, and my birth certificate with hands that looked calm and felt electric. The branch manager, a serious woman named Elaine Mercer, reviewed everything with exactly the level of skepticism I would have had in her position. Then she disappeared into a back office for what felt like an hour and was probably 11 minutes. When she returned, she said, "Ms. Bennett, we do have an archived box under those records. It has not been accessed in over 3 decades. Given the release documentation and supporting identity chain, I can authorize supervised review." The room tilted. The box was brought out in a private viewing room. Inside were 2 microcassettes, a packet of photographs, a notarized affidavit signed by Daniel Rowan, and copies of insurance documents tied not to his life, but to the Rowan Creek land valuations and pre-development holding interests. My hands started shaking for the first time since the hospital. The photographs showed men standing near survey stakes on the parcel months before public planning maps were issued. One of the men was Julian, much younger but unmistakable. Another was a developer whose name later appeared in regional property fraud reporting from years ago. One photo had a date stamp. Another had the back marked in my father's handwriting, before public notice. Ask who told them. The affidavit was even worse. In it, my father stated plainly that he believed certain parties were coordinating to exploit insider knowledge about the future value of trust land and that pressure was being applied to secure transfers before lawful beneficiaries fully understood the stakes. He named Julian Archer directly. He did not accuse him of physically harming anyone. He was too precise for that. But he documented financial motive, access, timing, and efforts to dismiss concerns as emotional overreaction. By the time I finished reading, Tessa had gone completely still. Elaine Mercer, to her credit, asked no unnecessary questions. There were also 2 audio cassettes with typed labels. We arranged immediately to have them digitized by a forensic media specialist Howard Pike recommended, because I was not about to risk handing irreplaceable evidence to some random strip mall service. That evening, in my hotel room, I finally broke. Not because I was weak. Not because I was confused. Because there is only so much a person can process before the body demands release. I sat on the edge of the bed in my coat and boots and cried with my face in my hands until I couldn't breathe properly. Tessa sat beside me without touching me at first. Then, when my shoulders started shaking, she put one arm around me and let me fall sideways against her. "I should have known sooner," I said into my hands. "No," she said immediately. "You couldn't have known what you were prevented from knowing. I'm a lawyer. This is what I do. Documents. Patterns. Motives. And he was your father, and she was your mother," Tessa said. "That changes the angle. It doesn't make you stupid. It makes you human." I cried harder after that, because she was right. The next week was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was paperwork, meetings, secure copies, timelines, consultations, and one very long conference with an estate litigation attorney named Adrian Cole, who had silver at his temples and the irritating habit of being right with a calm voice. Adrian reviewed the will, the house deed, the evidence chain, and the recent behavior from Julian and Margaret. Then he said they are likely going to do one of 3 things. 1. Pressure you to simplify administration for the sake of family peace. 2. Imply your mother was mentally compromised before death. 3. Surface some revised or ambiguous document to muddy intent. I leaned back in my chair. That is almost word for word what my father warned about. Adrian nodded. Smart man. We decided on a strategy that was as careful as theirs had once been. No emotional explosion. No accusations thrown into the wind. We would let them step into their own narrative and then cut the floor out from under it with documents, witnesses, and timing. Meanwhile, the digitized cassettes came back. The first one was mostly my father speaking into what sounded like a handheld recorder, describing dates, names, parcel numbers, and meetings he thought were relevant. It was not dramatic. It was devastating precisely because it was organized. He sounded steady, alert, concerned, yes, but not paranoid. He was building a record, not a fantasy. The second cassette hit harder. It contained part of a conversation my father had apparently recorded after a dinner at my grandparents' house. The audio was imperfect, but two voices were very clear. Daniel's and Julian's. Julian said, laughing lightly, "You're making this moral because you don't understand scale." Daniel answered, "No. I'm making it legal because you're counting on everyone else to call it family business." Then Julian again. "Be careful what you put in writing. A pregnant woman and a grieving fiancé can make almost anything sound sinister later." When I heard that, I put my hand over my mouth. My father had caught him, not confessing to violence. Julian was too intelligent for that. But dismissing future testimony before the future had even happened. Planning the frame in advance.
Tessa looked at me.
That's enough to sink him in any room where credibility matters. "Good," I said, and I meant it in a way that surprised even me. Because by then something in me had changed. I was no longer just trying to understand my parents. I was trying to finish what my father had started and what my mother had finally trusted me enough to continue. Julian made his move 10 days later. He requested a private family meeting at the office of the estate notary handling my mother's will, claiming there were concerns about administrative clarity. Margaret sent a text full of phrases like misunderstanding, emotions, and everyone wanting the best for Helen's memory. Adrian smiled when he read it and said, "They're coming in soft. That means they think they still have room." I agreed to the meeting.
Of course I did.
But I did not go alone. The lawyer's office sat on the second floor of a brick building downtown, with frosted glass doors and a conference room designed to calm people into signing things. Long walnut table, bottled water, neutral paintings, soft beige carpet. The kind of room where manipulation likes to wear professionalism. When I walked in, Julian was already there in a navy suit, hands folded neatly in front of him. Margaret wore cream and gold, as if estate disputes were a lunch theme. With them sat a local attorney I had never met, younger than I expected, with the cautious look of someone who sensed he had not been given the full story. Julian stood. "Nora." I took my seat beside Adrian. Tessa sat just behind us as my support person and witness. A court reporter arranged by Adrian was already in the room under the pretext of memorializing any contested estate discussion. Julian noticed her one beat too late. His smile thinned. "A formal transcript seems unnecessary." Adrian answered before I had to. "Transparency rarely harms honest people." Margaret looked offended by the existence of accountability. The notary, Mr. Levin, opened the meeting with polite language. Clarification of assets. Review of Helen Archer Bennett's final executed will. Confirmation of the house passing to me in full. Personal distributions. Nothing shocking. Nothing ambiguous. Then Julian leaned forward. "I believe," he said in that careful tone of his, "that because Helen's health declined significantly in the last year, it may be prudent to examine whether earlier drafts better reflected her settled intent." There it was. Earlier drafts. I felt my pulse slow instead of speed up. Adrian said, "Do you have such a draft?" Julian slid a folder across the table. "A working version." And signed, but discussed. Mr. Levin frowned faintly as he looked at it. "This is not an executed testamentary instrument." "No," Julian said. "But it supports the fact that Helen had concerns about leaving the property to Nora alone, especially given Nora's out-of-state life and the burdens of maintenance." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "You mean the burdens you wanted to oversee through a trust you controlled?" Margaret inhaled sharply. "That's unfair." "No," I said. "It's accurate." Julian gave me a sad little smile, the kind manipulative people use when they want witnesses to think they are dealing with someone emotional. "Nora, I understand this is a difficult time. But your mother was confused near the end. She revisited old fears. She became vulnerable to dramatic interpretations of the past. We are trying to protect her true wishes from panic and grief. There are moments when a room changes temperature without anyone touching the thermostat. That was one of them. I let him finish. Then I opened my leather portfolio and placed my father's letter on the table. My mother was not confused, I said. She was frightened. There is a difference. And she was frightened for reasons now supported by records going back 34 years. Julian's face did not fully change, but the muscles at the corners of his mouth tightened. Margaret said too quickly, "What is that?" "A letter." I said, "My father wrote the year I was born. The one my mother hid because she believed certain people around her were intelligent enough to destroy a life while still looking respectable in church." Silence. Real silence. Mr. Levin adjusted his glasses. Adrian slid copies to him and the court reporter. Julian did not touch the paper in front of him. "That is ancient family pain," he said quietly. "Not legal relevance." "Then perhaps these are," Adrian said. He laid out the copy of Daniel's affidavit, the Howard Pike memorandum, the bank inventory chain, and the dated photographs one by one. Not dramatically. Methodically. Like building a wall. The younger attorney Julian had brought started reading faster. Margaret went pale first. Julian still tried.
Of course he did.
"These are interpretations," he said. "A dead man's suspicions. Partial records. Half-understood business conversations from decades ago. You cannot drag old grief into an estate meeting and pretend it changes current reality." That was my cue. I nodded once to Adrian, and he handed a small speaker unit to Tessa. When my father's voice filled that conference room, calm and clear through age-softened audio, every person at that table went still. He identified himself. He stated the date. He named the Rowan Creek parcel. He described concerns about pre-notice valuation advantage, manipulated draft transfers, and attempts to isolate my mother by framing her as unstable if he pursued the matter openly. Then Julian's own younger voice came through from the recorded conversation. "You're making this moral because you don't understand scale."
No.
"I'm making it legal because you're counting on everyone else to call it family business. Be careful what you put in writing. A pregnant woman and a grieving fiancé can make almost anything sound sinister later." By the time the audio ended, Margaret was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone white. The young attorney beside Julian slowly removed his glasses and set them down. Mr. Levin looked at Julian with open disbelief. "Is that your voice?" Julian's answer took too long. And in legal rooms, delay is its own language. Margaret recovered first, though badly. "This is outrageous. Old recordings can be edited. People hear what they want to hear."
Tessa spoke for the first time.
"Forensic authentication is already underway. Would you like the lab contact information?" Margaret snapped her mouth shut. I reached into my bag one last time and took out the photograph of Julian standing by survey stakes on the trust parcel before public notice, the date stamp visible. Then the insurance interest documents. Then the copies showing his initials on valuation drafts. "For years," I said, looking directly at him, "you counted on grief, politeness, and time. You counted on my mother being too isolated to fight you. You counted on me growing up with the wrong story. And now you're still trying to call her confused because it's the only script you know." Julian finally looked at me fully then. Not like a niece. Not even like an opponent. Like a person he had misjudged and was recalculating too late. "You are making a serious accusation," he said.
No, I said.
"I'm documenting a serious pattern." The younger attorney pushed his chair back half an inch. "Mr. Archer, did you inform me there were historical allegations supported by preserved affidavits and audio materials?" Julian didn't answer him. That answer was loud too. Adrian turned to Mr. Levin. "Given this evidence and the contemporaneous effort to undermine the decedent's competence, any challenge to the will based on confusion would be deeply compromised." Mr. Levin nodded slowly. "I agree." The young attorney closed his folder. "I need to advise my clients separately." Margaret looked at him in disbelief. "You're leaving?" "I'm declining to continue this discussion under incomplete disclosure," he said, standing. That was the first visible crack. The second came from outside the room. Because Adrian, who believed in timing the way surgeons believe in pressure, had already arranged for a county investigator and a representative from the state real estate compliance office to be nearby if the meeting produced grounds for formal referral. Not arrest movie nonsense. Real consequences. Professional consequences. The kind intelligent people fear most because those are the consequences that stick. When Mr. Levin stepped out to make one call, 2 additional people entered 10 minutes later with measured expressions and folders of their own. They were introduced calmly. Historical land transfer review. Requested document preservation. Need for statements. Inquiry into prior filed valuations tied to the Rowan Creek parcel. Julian's color changed then. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just enough that all the blood seemed to leave his face at once. Margaret looked from him to them and back again, breathing too fast now. Julian. He said nothing. One of the investigators asked, "Mr. Archer, are you willing to confirm whether the initials on these draft materials are yours?" He stared at the papers. Then he did something I had seen him do my whole life whenever he was cornered but still wanted moral footing. He looked at me. "Nora," he said quietly, "family does not survive this kind of public cruelty." I almost laughed. Public cruelty. Not fraud. Not manipulation. Not gaslighting a pregnant woman. Not decades of theft wrapped in respectability. Public cruelty. I said, "My family did not survive what you did to it before I was born." That landed. Margaret made a sound like she wanted to argue and cry at the same time. We were trying to protect the family. From what? I asked. The truth? Or the loss of money? Neither of them answered. The rest of the meeting became what these things become when lies finally lose oxygen. Questions. Requests for preservation. Withdrawal of the estate challenge. Pending review. Formal notes. Faces changing. Chairs scraping. The slow collapse of a narrative built over decades. At one point, Julian rose as if to leave, then sat back down when the investigator reminded him he was free to leave, but not free to destroy any records. That might have been the moment I understood in a very practical way that power is often nothing more than a performance until enough people stop clapping. Outside the building, after it was over, I stood on the front steps and let the cold air hit my face. Tessa came up beside me first. "You okay?" "No," I said honestly. "But I'm upright. That counts." Adrian joined us a second later, buttoning his coat. "They're done in estate court. The rest will move on its own timeline." I looked out at the street, cars moving. Normally, people carrying coffee, the world refusing to stop just because mine had split open and started to heal at the same time.
"Thank you," I said.
Adrian gave a brief nod. "Your father did the hard part. Your mother did the brave part. You did the finishing." That sentence stayed with me. The months after that were quieter but not easy. Julian's firm placed him on leave first, then announced his resignation after internal review of legacy compliance concerns. That was the public language. Privately, I knew his clients were leaving fast, and his name had become expensive to stand near. Margaret's husband, who had built much of his social identity around polished family respectability, separated financial interests from her within the year. Not because he became noble overnight, but because scandal makes selfish people practical. The state's review into the old property transactions reopened records no one thought would ever matter again. Some statutes had run their course, some had not, and some consequences were civil rather than criminal. Real life is messy that way. Not every wrong ends in handcuffs, but exposure still matters. Financial penalties matter. Professional collapse matters. Forced admissions matter. History being corrected matters. As for the house, it remained mine exactly as my mother intended. I did not sell it. Not right away. Instead, I took 6 months of remote work flexibility and stayed long enough to sort through every room properly. I repainted the sewing room, but kept the shelves. I replaced the vanity mirror in my mother's bedroom because the old one had become too charged to live with daily, but I saved the frame in the attic instead of throwing it out. I restored the front porch. I planted new rose bushes where hers had thinned. And then I found something I had not expected to find in the middle of all that grief and work. Peace in small pieces. Morning coffee on the porch. Legal briefs on the dining room table my mother once used for library catalogs. Calls with Tessa that had started as crisis strategy and slowly shifted back into friendship and laughter. Visits from Howard Pike, who came once in spring and stood in the yard with me, looking toward the line of old trees and said, "Your father would have liked the way you think." I cried after he left, but it was a softer kind of crying. Not the kind that empties you, the kind that waters something. There was one final thing I did before I went back to Chicago full-time. I visited my father's grave. For years, I had not even known where he was buried. My mother had told me only after giving me the letter, and even then, it had barely registered through the shock. He was in a small cemetery outside town, under a simple stone that read Daniel Rowan, beloved son and father.
Father.
I stood there in a gray coat, with damp spring wind moving through the grass, and felt like time had folded in a strange way. I was 34 years old, successful on paper, outwardly composed, and yet standing there I also felt like the little girl who had once looked at fathers at school events and pretended not to care. "I know who you are now," I said out loud. It felt awkward for about 1 second. Then it didn't. "I'm sorry it took this long." The wind moved through the trees. "I finished it," I said quietly. "Or, at least I finished my part. And because I am my parents' daughter, because love in my family always seemed to tangle itself with evidence and restraint, I left a copy of the final estate order and the compliance referral summary in a sealed envelope at the base of the stone before I tucked it under a small memorial weight. It was a ridiculous thing to do, maybe, but it felt right, like reporting back. My life now is not a fairy tale, and I don't want to tell it like one. I still work too much sometimes. I still go quiet when people ask casual questions about family history. I still have moments when I look at a certain kind of handwriting or hear an old church hymn and feel grief rise so suddenly it takes my breath for a second. Healing is not neat. It does not arrive as one dramatic transformation and stay that way forever. But I am better. That matters. I know the truth about my parents now. My father was not a man who abandoned me. He was a man who tried to leave me a map. My mother was not a liar in the simple way anger first made me see her. She was a frightened, intelligent woman who survived among people skilled at making her doubt her own mind, and in the end, she still found a way to place the truth in my hands. As for me, I am no longer the daughter of a blank space. I am the daughter of two careful people who were damaged by the same cruel machinery in different ways, and I am also the woman who stepped out of that machinery before it could grind through one more generation. Julian wrote to me once after everything collapsed. Not an apology. He was too proud for that. It was 4 paragraphs of polished language about complexity, old misunderstandings, and the tragedy of family stories becoming public narratives. I read it once, smiled without humor, and had Adrian file it where it belonged. Then I blocked the number. Margaret tried a different approach months later. Flowers. A sympathy note on the anniversary of my mother's death. 2 lines about women surviving impossible times. I sent the arrangement to a hospice center and never answered. Boundaries, I learned, are not cruelty. Sometimes they are the first honest thing love has room to become. Last fall, I spent 1 weekend a month at the house and the rest of the time in Chicago. I turned the sewing room into a reading room and legal archive space. On one shelf sits the cedar keepsake box. Not hidden, not displayed like a trophy either. Just present. Part of the house. Part of the truth. And sometimes, when the late afternoon light hits that room in a certain way, I sit there with a cup of tea and think about my mother standing in front of that mirror, carrying her fear year after year, and my father sitting somewhere with pen and paper, trying to outlast people who believed charm could bury facts. They were not perfect. None of us are. But they loved me in the only ways they still knew how. Now, when people ask about my family, I don't say, "It's complicated." I say, "It took me a long time to know the truth, but I know it now." And that is enough. From everything I went through, I learned that silence can protect you for a season, but truth is what protects your future. If you're in a situation like mine back then, please remember this. When intelligent, manipulative people keep telling you that you're too emotional, too confused, or too dramatic, sometimes that is the clearest sign that your instincts are seeing exactly what they want hidden. If you've ever gone through something similar or you want to share your own story, write it in the comments below. Don't forget to share this story with your friends, like the video, and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories.